I love you. Whoever said that. Was it my merch people? Yeah, that's good. That's good. I do love them. It's good. I told Rob when he was going to read that prayer that we could all just go home afterwards. So I'll see you guys. I'm sorry. It's not real. I'm Joey. I'm the next gen pastor here, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So my day today was walking in this morning and fixing several things in here and then getting ready to preach. And I'm excited to be here. So when I look around my life and I see the people that I most admire in my life, it's people who have successfully navigated adversity in their lives. People who have overcome job situations, who have overcome health issues, family complications, and it's more than them just being a strong person. It's what makes them strong that I respect and that I admire. And what those people have and what I want to have is a relationship with God that creates a foundation for whatever might come in my life. I've got this now friend, former mentor that has, I would say, I said last hour, pretty much saved me as a kid, like was pursuing me as a 6th grade boy, making sure I was in community, and his name's Dan. And Dan models this well for me in my life. And a story from him is he lived in Birmingham, Alabama about 7 years ago. He moved down there to run a camp, and he got invited and felt like he was supposed to move back to central Indiana to run a camp on the west side, and it was like a church camp, and it wasn't profitable, and it was run down, and he said yes to God, to that invitation, moved there, turned the camp around, and then like the board of directors just said, okay, your services are no longer needed, sent him on his way. And 5 years later, that was 5 years ago, he's, I would say, bounced back in his life, and he helps people with their finances, and he runs his own business. And what I think made Dan respond well was his foundation-forming relationship with God. It was his foundation-forming relationship with God, his trust in God's care and God's plan for his life. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're in the 3rd week of our series, like Rob said, Better For It. And the last 2 weeks, we've talked about how to navigate life in challenging circumstances. And last week, Kevin, lead pastor who's on the beach somewhere right now, he talked to us about our superpower, which is our respondability. It's like responsibility and, respondability. He talked about how we can be better for it no matter what this circumstance is. And we looked at the life of Joseph, who's one of Jacob's 12 sons, and I'll give you a summary of Joseph that we talked about last week, and then we're going to pick up with him some more today. So Joseph spends about 20 years responding instead of reacting to things happening around his life. His story illustrates for us the sustaining, course-reversing, sanity-preserving impact that a measured response can make. And just like you and I, wherever we find ourselves, Joseph didn't know the end of his story. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he made a decision each time he responded to trust that the end would be good. And we can trust that the end will be good too. So we're going to look at his story and talk more about that. So if you can grab a Bible, there's one on the seat back in front of you or under the seat or on the app, or if you brought one, if you're online, you can grab one too. Good morning if you're online. Hi, welcome. Get some coffee. Yeah, if you're in the room, don't go get coffee. That would be rude. Genesis 39 is where we're going. And we're going to be spending the morning kind of going through the rest of the book of Genesis. So open it up, stay there with me. And as we go through this story together, we're going to continue to see that Joseph chooses the unusual, unexpected response each and every time, in each situation. So let me catch you up on the story. This is what we talked about last week, Joey's summary. Joseph was his dad's favorite. He was the youngest of a bunch of brothers. His brothers didn't like him, and they sold him into slavery in Canaan. And he gets taken to Egypt from there, and he gets sold again. So here's a map for perspective of where Canaan and Egypt are. They're not near each other. There's what I learned last hour, there's a legend on the bottom left of the map that shows you like 50 miles, so several hundred miles away he gets taken and sold again. Then Joseph, he's in Egypt. He finds favor in this master's house. He gets put in charge of the whole household. And then the master's wife wants to have an affair with him. He refuses. It's a Joey summary, right? So she frames him for committing a crime and gets him thrown in prison. In summary, this is Joseph's life so far. Nobody's looking out for him. Nobody's looking for him because they think he's dead. And nobody seems to care about him. And in spite of all of his unfortunate circumstances, Joseph continues to respond in unexpected ways, as if God is with him, as if God cares for him, as if God is looking out for him. So, Genesis 39, verses 20 and 21. So he took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. The NIV translation, so we're looking at the NLT, but this is a verse from the NIV, says, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. The word kindness in the Hebrew text, which is the original text of this Old Testament, actually means loving kindness, and it's a covenant word. It means that Joseph is in a relationship with God. A covenant relationship, the same kind that his father had with God. But let's be real. It doesn't seem like God has done much for Joseph in this loving kindness relationship. Like, what does loving kindness look like? And here's what it looked like for Joseph. Genesis 39, 22 and 23. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him and caused everything that he did to succeed. So even though Joseph's in prison, the Lord is with him. The Lord shows him kindness, grants him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. This might seem like a problem for us because, like if it does for me, if God was with me, why would I need to have favor in the eyes of a prison warden? Like, why would I need to be in prison for a crime I didn't commit? If I put myself in Joseph's sandals, it'd be tempting to think, like, maybe God could just show his kindness to somebody else for a while, like my brothers. But we don't see that in Joseph's story. The story gets more interesting because some time goes by, and Pharaoh, who's the king of Egypt, he has a falling out with his chief cupbearer and his chief baker. And he throws them in the same prison that Joseph is in. So Genesis 40, verse 4, it says, they remain in prison for quite some time, the cupbearer and the baker, and the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, who looked after them. So just a side note, this story is compressed. There's a lot of time that passes in the story. It's not just like verse. It's years and years and years. And that's how most narratives are in the Bible. And so the story takes a twist. These guys are in prison. Joseph's taking care of them. And then this weird thing happens. And both men, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, or former chief cupbearer and baker, I suppose, they have a dream on the same night. And they're both freaked out by their dream. They're upset by their dream. And Joseph says, like, hey, why are you upset? Well, he's taking care of them. And this is what they say in Genesis 40, verse 8. We both had dreams last night, but no one can tell us what they mean. Interpreting dreams is God's business, Joseph replied. Go ahead and tell me your dreams. So interpreting dreams, the whole dream realm back in those days, it was taken very seriously. And there were standards of what different things meant. Like if you dreamed about this, it means that. But not to Joseph. He says interpreting dreams is God's business. And since Joseph's in a covenant relationship with God, he can be the one to work on God's behalf to interpret those dreams. So he interprets the cupbearer's dream, and it's a really good one. In 3 days, the cupbearer is going to be restored to his place by Pharaoh. And the cupbearer is thrilled with the interpretation. And so Joseph says, well, just one thing in return. And so in Genesis chapter 40, verses 14 and 15, he says, and please remember me and do me a favor. when things go well for you. Mention me to Pharaoh so he might let me out of this place. For I was kidnapped from my homeland, the land of the Hebrews, and now I'm here in prison. But I did nothing to deserve it. So what I want to point out in this verse is something that's true for all of us, I think, and it's that even if we're responding well in less than ideal situations, it doesn't mean that we have to like it. We don't have to like the situation. Joseph didn't enjoy being in prison. He wasn't immune from suffering or sleeping on a rock bed or not showering or whatever you imagine their prison was like. He wanted out. And so it was natural that he said to the cupbearer, like, hey, please remember me. And even though God was with Joseph and Joseph was responding well, he was still frustrated by his circumstance. This is what I imagine Joseph's prayer life with God was like. It probably started with, this isn't fair, and ended with, but I'll keep serving you every time he prayed. I'm guessing it was longer than those two sentences, but that's the beginning and the end. So back to our story, right? The baker heard Joseph tell the cupbearer this good news about his dream, and he wanted his own interpretation. And so Joseph told the baker, like, hey, this is what's going to happen to you. You're going to get killed by Pharaoh in 3 days. And 3 days go by, and both of the interpretations come true. And the cupbearer ends up going back and being with Pharaoh. And every time someone opens the prison door for the next 2 years, Joseph thinks, today could be my day. And every time it wasn't. The reality was the cupbearer went back to be with Pharaoh and forgot about Joseph, at least for a while. So Joseph, this young man, right, he was 17 when he was sold. He's now in his late 20s, and God's supposedly with him, and he's the forgotten one in prison. So these 2 years go by, and then Pharaoh has his own dreams. They're disturbing. Nobody can interpret them that's around Pharaoh. And then the cupbearer is like, light bulb on. I remember this guy Joseph in prison. He interpreted my dreams. Let's go get him. And so Genesis chapter 41, verses 14 through 16 say this. Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once, and he was quickly brought from prison. After he shaved and changed his clothes and hopefully showered, he went in and he stood before Pharaoh. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream last night, and no one here can tell me what it means. But I've heard that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. It's beyond my power to do this, Joseph replied, but God can tell you what it means, and he can set you at ease. So Joseph here, in this moment, he has this chance to get out of prison. And what he does is what he'd always done. He doesn't pretend like it depends on him. He pretends like the reality was that it depends on his God, right? And I say his God because Pharaoh thought that he was a god and that there were other gods, and the Egyptian gods were more powerful than the Hebrew God that Joseph followed, but Pharaoh really wanted his dreams interpreted, and Joseph said he could do it, so he let Joseph proceed. And Joseph tells Pharaoh that his dreams mean, the summary, right? That there's going to be 7 years of plenty, then 7 years of famine, and a famine so severe that the years of plenty will be forgotten. And then he leans in to Pharaoh and he starts giving Pharaoh advice on what to do. Someone who existed in Pharaoh's hierarchy or leadership structure would have known better than to lean in and tell Pharaoh what to do. But what did Joseph have to lose at that point? Like, go back to prison? So here we go, Genesis 41, verses 37 to 40. Joseph's suggestions were well received by Pharaoh and his officials. Can we find anyone like this? So Pharaoh asked his officials, can we find anyone like this man so obviously filled with the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has revealed the meaning of his dreams, of my dreams to you, clearly no one else is intelligent or wise as you are. You'll be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours. So talk about a quick rise to the top for Joseph, from prison to second in command. Pharaoh putting Joseph in this place was a direct result of Pharaoh realizing that the Spirit of God was with Joseph. Like, God is at work in Joseph's life. So What Joseph does with that is he gets to work. He stores up all the grain that he can find for Pharaoh, more than he could count. He bought up all the people's extra grain. He built storehouses. He filled those with grain. And this happened for 7 years. And then the 7 years of famine start. The rain stops falling, and it wasn't long before the people in Egypt were hungry, and they were coming to Pharaoh for food. And not just the people from Egypt. Side note, it occurred to me when I was studying this that when Joseph interpreted the cupbearer and the baker's dreams, it took 3 days to know if it was true. And it took 7 years to know if this one was true, which is crazy. It's a long time. The story continues now for us when Joseph's father, Jacob, in the land of Canaan, hundreds of miles away, hears that there's grain for sale in Egypt. So Genesis 42, verse 1 and 2, when Jacob heard that grain was available in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why are you standing around looking at one another? I've heard that there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy enough to keep us alive. Otherwise, we will die." So the brothers, they go to Egypt. And then the story has another fun turn because at this point, Joseph's about 40 years old. His brothers haven't seen him since he was 17. I don't look the same as I did when I was 17, and I'm not yet 40, but I'm looking it in the eye. And the brothers are all married, they have families, they assume that he's dead or somewhere else, so they're not expecting Joseph, right? So Genesis 42, 6 and 7 says, since Joseph was governor of all Egypt and in charge of selling grain to all the people, it was to him that his brothers came. When they arrived, they bowed down before him with their faces to the ground. Joseph recognized his brothers instantly, but he pretended to be a stranger and he spoke harshly to them. "Where are you from?" he demanded. So I can't imagine all the thoughts that were running through Joseph's head when he saw his brothers. It's like, I could get them back. It's all their fault. But if my father's alive, I want to see him. Or maybe he thought, it's my family and I've missed them. And he probably thought 1,000 things. But what Joseph does here is the same thing he always does, is he doesn't react, but he acts like he doesn't know them. He sells them grain. He sends them back to their father. And he asks them to come back again and to bring the other brother. So there's a lot of quirky, fun details in this story. If it's been a while since you've read it, I encourage you to read the whole thing through. So what happens next is the brothers, they come back and they bring their youngest brother, Benjamin. And Benjamin and Joseph had the same mom, so they're full brothers. Jacob had 4 wives. And when he sees his brother Benjamin, he then reveals himself to his brothers. He makes them a big meal. He takes them to his house. They think they're in big trouble. And then he sends his staff away, and then he reveals himself to his brothers. In Genesis chapter 45, verses 3 through 5, "I am Joseph," he said to his brothers. "Is my father still alive?" But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. "Please come closer," he said to them. So they came closer, and he said again, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset. Don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives." So his brothers were terrified, and Joseph's response is consistent, as it always is. He's like, "Don't be upset. Don't be angry. God sent me here." When we are able to believe and to respond in situations in our own lives as if God's with us, then that helps us gain a perspective on what's behind the circumstance that we can't get any other way. When we're able to believe and respond in these situations, it helps us get a perspective on what's behind our circumstance that we can't gain any other way. So now that Joseph is standing on the other side of being sold twice and thrown in prison, he can clearly see the reason that this happened. And I'm not saying that God wanted his brothers to sell him into slavery, but I am saying that God can take the negative intentions of people and he can turn them for his good. He can take the negative intentions of people and he can turn them around for his good. And it's helpful for us as people following Jesus when we respond in situations and when we don't react. It's helpful for us. When we choose to respond like Joseph does, we will gain perspective we can't get any other way. If all we do is react, all the time, we won't ever have the perspective that allows us to move ahead with our priorities right. Reacting doesn't properly take into account our knowledge, our corporate history with each other. So corporate history is this idea that whatever the context is for your situation, all the pieces of that you've been through with God, that you've been through with others, that's what I'm saying corporate history means. So reacting doesn't take corporate history into account. It doesn't take into account what we know to be truest about ourselves or the context of the situation. It doesn't. Responding, on the other hand, is measured. It's thought through. It's likely not in the moment. It's planned. It takes into account as much as we can so that we can make the best decisions possible. Nobody in the story that we've been looking at today understood that this encounter with Joseph and his brothers had to happen. It had to happen because God's entire plan for salvation hung in the balance of Joseph's response. The 12 brothers in this story represent the 12 tribes of Israel, and the Messiah, Jesus, the one we're trying to follow, would come through the lineage of these 12 tribes. Jesus did for all of us what Joseph did for his brothers on that day. This is why we spent the last 3 weeks talking about being better for it, about taking measured responses. Never underestimate the power of a measured response. Don't do it. Never underestimate it. The rest of the story wraps up like this. Joseph brings his whole family to Egypt to live so they can be close to the grain and be together. Dad, brothers, their families, their children. Remember, they're not young anymore. He gives them places to live. He provides for them for years. And then his dad dies and his brothers get scared. They think maybe now that dad is dead, Joseph's going to enact his revenge on us for what we did to him. And so Genesis 50, the end of Genesis, verses 18 through 20, says this: Then the brothers came and they threw themselves down before Joseph. Look, we're your slaves, they said. But Joseph replied, don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? You intended it to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. Joseph had no ulterior motive in bringing his family close. He just wanted to be with them. He was consistent in his response, which shouldn't surprise us at this point, but his brothers just couldn't believe that he would be. They doubted his goodness even after everything that had happened. The Greek version of the Old Testament, which is translated from the Hebrew, says a part of this verse like this. Joseph's response was, "Do not be afraid, for I belong to God. Since I belong to God, who am I to act like God or step in the place of God?" God's intentions became a reality for the world, really, through one man's unprecedented, circumstance-defying responses. They did. None of it seemed like a big deal on their own. Each little instance didn't seem like a big deal, but as they added up, you get this weighty response. And altogether, Joseph's responses were a part of the unfolding of the story of my redemption and the story of your redemption, of his plan, God's plan for salvation for the entire world. The truth is that our responsibility, it gives us the opportunity to be better for it. Whatever it is, whatever's going on in your life, it gives you the opportunity to be better for it. We each get to decide when things happen to us whether or not we're going to take a measured response or we're going to react. And so here are 3 things, and I'm sure there's more things that can happen for you and for me when we respond instead of making quick reactions. The first thing I thought of is that our hearts will align more with the heart of God. When we take measured responses, our hearts will align more with the heart of God. The second thing is that the situation, it might never make sense to us, but we can trust that the end will be good when we make measured responses. In John 16, verse 33, it says, "In this world you'll have trouble, but take heart because I've overcome the world." That's Jesus talking, and if we believe in Jesus, we can believe that the end will be good. And then the third thing is that if you live your life in a posture of responding and not reacting, people will notice that you're different. They'll just notice that you're different. And they'll ask you, probably at some point, they'll ask you, why do you act like that? Why do you respond that way? And that'll give you the chance to tell them. And if you're bold in that moment, you can tell them it's because of Jesus. Be awesome. It'll help you lead people to Jesus. It's really cool. And so if you guys, church, friends, a lot of you, hopefully all of you, I'd love to be friends with all of you. If you're in a time of your life where things are all good, I think this message is for you. Get in the habit of giving God credit when it's easy, so you can keep giving it to him when it's hard. Take some time, build on the foundation of your life with Jesus, with your family, with your church. Build this positive history so you have something to look back on, draw from. You will need it someday when you enter a time in your life that's not so good, and you probably will. If you're in a circumstance in life right now where it's not good, this message is for you too. Lean on the foundation you've built already. Let your people in. Ask God how he might have you to respond in different situations around you, and believe that you're going to get through and that the end of the story will be good. There is a leader here in Merge, which is our high school ministry at Grace. We meet on Sunday nights from 6 to 7:30, so if you're a high schooler, see you tonight. And 5 years ago, this leader came to Grace Fishers, and he started building a foundation, getting involved with small groups in their personal relationship with Jesus, and then out of nowhere, seemingly, their spouse left them. They leaned on the community that they'd been building. They leaned on it. The way that they are now using their singleness to pursue Jesus and their community in this new season of their life that they didn't even choose, right, is incredible. And it doesn't mean that they liked what happened. But as they approached the other side now, they responded, and God used a negative situation and he turned it around for his good. Joseph had no idea before all this happened to him in his life that it would happen. But he had this covenant relationship with God anyway. He had it before. His responses were the overflow of who he was. It wasn't some unexpected thing that he did. His responses were an overflow of who he was. So when he first got sold into slavery, he had no idea that there'd be a 20-year journey and then he would be put in a place of great influence. How could he know? He had no idea it would happen to him. He had no idea what the next step would be, but he trusted God each step of the way, and that helped him to make a measured response. So for us, as we get ready and we close out the service today in this new year, wrapping up this series, being better for it, we thought it would be good for us to remember and to re-up our individual commitments together today as we take communion together. So I'm going to pray to close my message, and then Rob is going to come lead us through some communion. Jesus, thank you. Thank you that we have access to the Bible, first of all, that we can read these stories of what happened thousands of years ago. And thank you for the example of Joseph being in this covenant relationship with God. And thank you that we have that covenant relationship with you and with the Spirit. And I just pray that the Spirit would be with each of us as we live our lives. Help us be intentional in our responses in our own life. And help us to remember our covenant relationship with you through the communion we're about to take. Help us to be a church of people. More than anything, God, help us be a church of people that's known for how we respond and how we love our community. We thank you for this day, and we praise you in your name. Amen.